Welcome to your next great novel. I'm your host, Phil Williams, and today I have thriller and nonfiction author William Brown on the show. He is the author of 9 suspense novels and 2 nonfiction books. His latest book, Our Vietnam Wars, is a #1 Amazon new bestseller in military history. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Hey, good to talk to you, Phil.
Great. Thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little more about your author journey, how you started and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I started quite a while ago, but I was a history major in college, not a English major, and basically for many of my early years, I was a reader, and I read international suspense thrillers, every one that came out, and I'd read 2 3 books a week, and finally I just read one too many bad books, and I even remember exactly which one it was that
Oh,
made me decide that I could write. I was reading I won't mention his name is Clive Cussler, but it was it was one of his books where they had if I remember correctly, they had a battleship sailing up the Potomac River, and it was going to shell the capital until the
oh.
hero saved the situation. I thought, you can't do that. Anybody who knows those rivers, there's bridges. You can, but he got like $1 million advance for this thing. I said, well, shoot, I can write something that bad. So I went to the library and got out some books on, how do you write a
Bill,
novel?
what year was this?
Sure. Oh God, early '80s, I think. And
Okay, okay, wow.
I said, I could try this, and so I sat down with pen and paper, and then just a typewriter with a gallon of whiteout, and I typed
Oh,
this thing out, and start and sent copies off to publishers, and copies would go out, come back, go out, come back, and I don't know, I was 20 or 30 rejections into it when I got a paperback company wanted to buy my book. Well, of course, I was dancing around the campfire. I thought that was tremendous, and signed this contract with a company called Tower Publications or something. And a couple of months go by, and I get a phone call from this woman who was the editor in chief of a publishing company, wants to buy my book. And I said, well, gee, I'm sorry, but I've already sold it to this company. And I told her who it was, and she said, have they paid you any money? And I said, no. And she said, well, they never will. They just kind of take your book, and you never get paid. So I said, okay. And so she had me send them a letter, demanding payment, and I did. And then I got back one of these letters from a New York law firm where the entire top third of the piece of stationery was columns of names of lawyers, to impress me, I guess. And I wrote them back and said, that's fine, pay me or give me my rights back. And that letter came back addressee unknown. So at that point, I thought I was probably pretty clear to go ahead. So I signed that, and these people bought it as a hardback. And I was all excited about that. What it was a company from a Canadian publishing company that was reaching down to the U.S. to they wanted to get some U.S. imprints. They wanted to publish their Canadian writers in the U.S. and they needed some U.S. writers to balance it off. So they hired her, and she had stuck in her bottom drawer any manuscripts that came by that she thought looked pretty good. So that's how I got published. It's a matter of luck and timing. And then I had a subsequent book get published by a big publishing company in New York, and then I had an agent for a while, and then I got a couple of big agents, but then I got off doing other things and off trying to write screenplays and doing some other things. By the time I got back on writing novels, I had not realized that the time had kind of passed me by, and too many people that I had worked with had left the business or retired or whatnot, and you're quickly starting from scratch. So at that point, which was about the time that the Amazon revolution hit, and that really knocked a lot of the publishers into a cocked hat, and I decided that, well, maybe I'll just try doing this self-publishing. And so since then, I took some of my early stuff and rewrote it for ebooks, and then most of the rest of my stuff is original ebooks, and I've kind of enjoyed just doing it myself. It's certainly much easier if you just sell a book to a publisher and then you're rid of it and your headaches are gone, but you don't make much money doing that. You have much more control of what you're doing in self-publishing, and I think that's the part of it I like, as you and I were discussing it.
Right.
The marketing aspects of it drives you nuts, but there's certainly I think a nice personal reward when you do have some successes doing it yourself. And I've, as you said, I've put out now my first 5 novels I wrote were freestanding stories, and I believe very strongly in that the dramatic theory and character arcing and all that stuff of each book stood on its own. I had individual characters and all that. And as I said, the first 5 books were all, some were set at the end of action adventure stories at the end of World War II. One was in Egypt in 1962. So they've all kind of had a little historic bent to them. And then the 2 were terrorist-related stories. And then I finally wrote the first of my Bob Burke books, which had to do with a retired Delta Force major who just kind of gets himself in the wrong situations and finds himself kind of a knight errant thing where he manages to solve problems for other people and this kind of thing. And I wrote the first Burke book, and it did really well. And I had not intended that to be a series, but I figured, well, why not? So then I had already kind of started on another book, so I just changed the characters and turned it into a second Burke book, and then I did a third Burke book, and those have done very well. And I've started a 4th, and I've had a lot of people a lot of my fans on those books want me to do another one, so I've started it. But then meanwhile, about 2 years ago, as you mentioned, I was in Vietnam. I was not particularly in combat. I was there at the end, and it's always bugged me that so many of the young people, and you don't need to be all that young, know very little about the war, know very little about what we did, and the only thing they do know is the Oliver Stone movie, and think we were all crawling through the jungle on the Cambodian border smoking dope. That was Oliver's war, but that wasn't particularly my war, or most of the other guys who were there. And so I said, I got this idea that to me there was 100 different wars, and this is probably true of any war. It's probably true of the Middle East. It's probably true of World War II. But there are 100 different wars based on what unit you were in, the year you were there, where you were, your rank, your race, all that stuff. And so it's
a lot of different stories.
Exactly. And I said, I'm going to see, because I live in a big community with a lot of retired veterans. And I said, I'm going to see if I can get any interest from anyone and see if I can. My notion was to do small little vignettes, short, 4, 5, 6 pages on each veteran, where they came from, who they were, what their jobs were, what their memories were, and then most importantly, what they did after they came home. And I've just found it just grew from there. And the first book that I published had 100 stories in it, because I said there were 100 different wars. And I intentionally have everybody in there, from cooks to truck drivers to Marines to medics to helicopter pilots, everything. And as I said, telling their individual little story. And then that was going to be the end of it. And then I had a lot of guys come to me wanting, really volunteering, hey, you got to do my story too. And these were more people though who had stuff that they wanted to talk about. And then actually that has now worked its way into and that book came out last spring. And then I wasn't going to do a third one or a fourth one, but I've had so many other people come forth that the third one is now going off to my production people later today. Again, it's more guys and women with stories. I did not hang around with vets after the war. I was an officer in the Army. I went out, had a family, went off and did my job. I didn't develop any physical problems or any of that kind of thing, and hadn't really gotten into it, but into the whole veteran community. But the things that really stunned me as I wrote these books were a couple of things. One was, you would be astonished at how many of the guys I interviewed, I'm the first person that they've talked to in 50 years. Not their wives, not their friends, not their kids. And it became, but we're all about 70 years old, and a lot of we're dying off faster than they should be. And these guys knew it was time to talk. And I mean, I had, for an old mystery writer, this has proven to be a very humbling experience. I mean, the number of just doing this has done a lot of good for a lot of the people who talk to me, but also from the reviews. the books have done a lot of good for a lot of other people who've read them, who, in terms of now I've seen these reviews on the books of, now I know what my husband went through. Now I know what my father went through. And so that part,
That's
the
moving.
second thing I think is I had no idea the percentage of people with problems. I'll bet, if you'd asked me at the beginning what percentage of people had, say, Agent Orange problems, I'd have probably guessed 15-20%, because that was the percentage of guys who were out in the field crawling around through the bush. Of the people I've interviewed, it's more like 60 or 70%, because they sprayed the stuff everywhere. They even sprayed it where I was. I didn't know that. They were using it as weed killer, like it was Roundup or something. And it has affected, it's killing a lot of people. And it doesn't take an effect till you reach about 50, 60 years of age.
Was it actually
There's a
glyphosate?
ton of people.
Were they using glyphosate? Agent Orange, was it actually glyphosate?
I don't know.
The active ingredient of Roundup. I thought it was just like a very potent, non-diluted glyphosate, which is the same stuff that people spray on there.
I really don't know what it was exactly. I know from an interview with an Australian guy that they made this stuff was largely, a lot of it was made in Australia. Exactly, but guys got it. It was in the water. It hung around, and it didn't. I mean, just the number of, there's like 13 or 14 official diseases related to this, and it's when you run into these guys and people say, well, guys of that age, they're going to get prostate cancer, they're going to get this, that, and the other thing. True, but when you run into guys who've had no history of these diseases in their families and no history of, and have 2, 3, 4 diseases, then something's wrong. But that and the PTSD were just stunning, guy after guy. But and I'm not sure that a lot of the aspect of not talking and a lot of the aspects of, I think that it's probably not. There's a certain commonality to any war. I think guys who came home from World War II, while they had a parade and we didn't, I think that a lot of those guys had problems they didn't talk about either. And I'm convinced that if you think we got problems with Vietnam vets, wait till all of these Afghanistan, Iraq vets, start reaching an age. I mean, these guys have been doing 6, 8 tours over there, and the psychological damage that's doing to people that we won't see for another 10, 20 years. But I think that's the next big crisis to hit the veteran community.
Right.
But
there's already a suicide crisis.
Yeah. Exactly. Maybe it's different. Maybe they don't have Agent Orange. They got other things. But it's, right. You just can't put young people into those situations and expect them to come home the way they went over. And it kind of got me going. As I said, this wasn't a crusade. But it's really kind of hooked me to tell these people's stories. And the things that I guess even I found very, very startling is that the West Point guys and even the generals and admirals all have about the same opinion on the Vietnam War, along with the vast majority of guys I interviewed, who are the most patriotic and loyal Americans, but they all think that war was a horrible waste of people on both sides, and we had really no business being there doing what we did, fighting it the way we fought it. Just a tremendous loss of young American lives and Vietnamese lives. Right. And you get that, when you hear that from guys who were generals and admirals who were in the know, and also the way all the interference from Washington as to how the war was fought, as to what you could shoot at, what you couldn't shoot at. Real stories. About Johnson personally picking out targets that they could, and personally saying, well, you can't bomb here, you can't bomb there, and that's just no way to fight a war. And they all got very disgusted with it. A lot of guys left the service over the way the war was being fought. It was just the political mismanagement out of Washington.
One thing I find very interesting about Vietnam, but correct me if I'm wrong, it was the last time we had a draft. I wonder what would happen if they tried to do a draft now.
Politically infeasible, but it's unfortunate because I honestly believe that there should be a draft just so that more people have an experience with what the military's like. I mean, the Israelis do it. There's a lot of companies. I think it helps patriotism. I think it helps people, gives some skin in the game. One of the things that I'm personally disgusted with is all you find in Washington, especially in Congress, is lawyers who've never served in the military. They've never held jobs outside of most of the guys in Congress graduated from law school, went to work for a politician, and then replaced them. And
Right.
they've never done anything. We have created a governing class. Both
Like
Bushes were in the military. Now, and the younger Bush was, maybe he was in the
he was in the Air National Guard in Texas,
but
I
at
think.
least he was in uniform. He was the last one, and we don't have any people in the decision-making positions in the government who served in the military, and of course their kids are always the last ones to go, and they've never been. So what do they know? And yet they don't seem to realize, as with so many of these wars, it's easy to get in a war. It's very difficult to get out. And that's what they seem to keep forgetting time after time when they go sending us to places. And I personally, especially as a history major, if anybody had read the history of Vietnam, as I think the Ken Burns series did a wonderful job explaining Vietnam before we got there. But if anybody had really looked at that, we certainly would have never gone in and done what we did the way we did it. But the same is true of Afghanistan and Iraq. If anybody had studied the history of the Middle East, I don't think we'd have gone doing what we did the way we did it. They just think we can throw all these boots on the ground and not realize how long it takes to get out of those quagmires once you get in.
Right. Well, if you go back to the founding fathers, we're not supposed to have a standing army at all.
No,
we're supposed to have we're supposed to have local militias, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Did any of your interviews stick out in particular?
Yeah, a couple of them. Many have, and they're all unique. But a couple that really were memorable, and I think important. One was a woman named Teresa Bernard who lives I think she lives in South Carolina. Her name was MP. She goes by her initials, and she joined the Navy as a nurse because she felt she wanted to do something, and she served on the USS Repose. There were 2 hospital ships floating off of around Da Nang, and that woman, I mean, she was an OR nurse, an operating room nurse, for 12 months over there, and you talk about a difficult tour of duty. By the time it was finished, she had and she had to argue with it, but she ended up with such a terrible PTSD and stuff that eventually she had to quit nursing because of all the stuff that she saw day in and day out on those and she was there during the height of the war, and a lot of Marines and a lot of guys from the 1st Air Cav that went across those operating tables, and it was just terrible thing again, she was as young as she was in her early 20s, and it was just a terrible, I mean, she helped a lot of people, but what an experience for somebody that age to be. And I said it ended up where she couldn't take nursing anymore after that.
So they had the hospital on the ship?
Yeah, it was hospital, old World War II hospital ship. They had 2 of them that sailed along, and they just flew in helicopters right from the battlefields. I mean, they were cutting fatigues off guys, and and of course it was the worst of kind of like the operating room on MASH, but this was for real. I think they had several thousand patients on those boats. So I mean, they dealt with large numbers of wounded young men. And then another one that was so amazing. The awards and medals that were given out were so random over there. Like there was a guy named Bob Robeson who was the son of a minister, and he became a helicopter pilot, but he didn't want to fly a regular assault helicopter. He volunteered to be a dust-off pilot. Those were the guys who flew the helicopters unarmed, with the big red crosses painted on them, with a white square with a red cross, which just made a better target for the NVA to shoot at. And he was there for a year, 365 days, and he flew 968 missions. They picked up like 2,500 wounded guys during that. And of course, when the dust-off chopper was going in, pick up casualties, I mean, 9 times out of 10, they were doing that under fire. And of course, he lost a number of helicopters. They were shot to pieces several times. But to do that, and he ended up getting, I think, 2 or 3 distinguished flying crosses. I mean, he could have got 365 of them. I mean, this guy, you talk about nerve to go doing what those guys, those dust-off pilots did day in and day out. And I guess one of my favorite ones was a guy named Tom Huck from Boston. Talk about wrong place, wrong time. He was a CB. He was a plumber. He was one of the Seabees built things, and they were building a base somewhere for the Army, and they usually took truck convoys up to where they were working, and he had something to do that morning, maybe the dentist or something, and they had what they would do is they would just go out. He was at Da Nang, and there was a big helicopter pads there, and they would just go out to the helicopter pads and find somebody going where they wanted to go and hook a ride if they couldn't get up by truck. So they called that hopping a taxi to go somewhere. And so he found a taxi going to Camp Eagle, which was where he was wanting to go, and got in the thing. And he was just dressed. I guess he had his plumber tools, and he just had his fatigues on, and he was carrying an M16, but a soft hat and all this stuff. And they get halfway there, and the helicopter gets diverted there's a Marine unit that's under fire and has casualties, and they get diverted to go pick up wounded. And next thing he knows, they're dropping into a major battle, and he's helping load wounded onto the helicopter, and they're getting shot. There's a line of NVA coming out of a wood line attacking them, and the door gunner gets shot, and so he takes over for the door gunner, and then he's looking, and the co-pilot gets killed, and the pilot gets wounded, and he's going back and forth with trying to fire the machine gun at the enemy coming in, and he ends up slapping a compress on the chest of the pilot long enough so that the pilot could stay conscious long enough to get the helicopter up in the air. They're loaded with wounded. They flew a few miles to where there was a medical facility, and they kind of crash land the thing on the pad, and they thought he was wounded too, because he was so covered with blood with all these guys he was trying to help and firing the machine gun. Basically he was the one who kept that helicopter in the air the whole time, and landed it. And he went back to his base and saw his chief and explained what happened, why he never ended up at Camp Evans. And he said, well, should I report this or something? And his chief said, nah, you really weren't supposed to be on the helicopter. And of course there was no written record of it or anything, so he just kind of forgot about it. And
wow.
He never talked about it. And then his father kept asking him, well, what did you do over there? And he never. Finally, he wrote his father a letter, and he gave me a copy of that letter where he explained to his father what had happened. He too had a lot of PTSD and from that incident, and I was thinking to myself, here's a guy who should have got, probably a Silver Star, a Navy Cross, or something for what he had done, and nobody knew about it. And that, literally no one. And until he talked to me, and and I've published it, but it's. There's so many cases like that of guys just being at the wrong place at the wrong time and doing things. But that Tom Huck story just really, I just really found so amazing. Of, talk about hop the wrong taxi, as he said.
Yeah, he did.
But anyway, there's so many stories like that of guys with
the right place and the right time for those wounded that were on there.
Yeah, exactly. And he said he never found out if the pilot lived. Because he said pretty soon the medics were all rushing everybody off the helicopter, and he was kind of left there standing by himself with this all shot up helicopter, and he didn't, all of a sudden everything was quiet, and he looked down, and his uniform was just covered with blood. By the time he got back to his unit, it just looked like the dry red mud that you got over there, and so nobody particularly thought anything of it. And he never even told the guys in his unit. He said it wasn't until 40 years later they had a reunion, and he was telling some of the guys. Nobody knew what he had done that day, but just an amazing. But there's stories like that you feel good writing, because again, he then gave copies of that book to his kids, and I had another guy whose story I published in the book, and he and his sons had never gotten along, and he concluded it was just his own PTSD from the war. And so he was getting copies of the book and giving to them, hoping that they would read it and then maybe understand in context what he had gone through and why he was a little bit,
how it affected his relationship,
how it affected
with his
him and everything else. Yeah. And I, and that's the kind of stuff that really makes, as I said, for an old mystery writer, none of that were things I was expecting when I started writing these books. But
what do you think's been your biggest? I mean, you talked about marketing a little bit being difficult as an author. What do you think has been your biggest setback or struggle as an author?
Boy, I wish I had a lot more time. I've probably got, like you, I've got so many things I haven't read of from website postings and articles people have written. I've got a whole computer full of or different blogs that that I wish you can either do all that stuff and really spend a lot of time marketing, or you can write, and it's pretty darned hard to try to keep up with both of them.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. So it's become very difficult to differentiate yourself. So a lot of
Yeah.
authors, they do that through marketing. And one of the interesting things about marketing is that even if you market perfectly, you know everything about marketing, if the product's not good, then you're essentially wasting your time and money. And
Yep.
that's one thing that I noticed from you is that you have very, very good reviews on all your
Yeah.
books. That
Very
people,
high star ratings. I think
yeah,
about my lowest is a 4.4 or 4.5. Most of mine are 4.4, 4.5, up to 4.7 and 4.8. I got
yeah,
one
it's
4.9.
fantastic. How would you
Yeah.
say that you're different than the million other authors on Amazon?
I I work hard on the actual writing. I mean, I don't consider myself a gifted writer, because it constantly amazes me where you see these guys who are writing 3,000 words a day.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, how can you do that? And they write a book in a month. And I can't do that. It takes me a month to do, or it takes me a year to do a novel usually, but through the whole process. But
Right.
and I spend a lot of time rewriting and trying to outline a little bit, trying to keep my storyline straight. But just the actual craft of it, and you have to start with a hook. I mean, you have to start with something that's going to interest people, and some fun characters, and start with action. I mean, that's what there's a Latin phrase, in media res. I don't know exactly how that translates, but it means you start in the middle, you start in the action, you start at a focal point, your story, and you got to do that to get. If you haven't, I find myself, I'm much more. I used to finish every book I started. I don't do that anymore. If I'm 50, 60, 70 pages into a book and I'm not hooked yet, or I don't know what's going on or why, I just delete it.
Mm.
It's easier to do from a Kindle. You just get rid of that. The books have to interest you, because again, there's so much competition out there,
Right.
and so many
No, you're
people.
talking about as a reader, as a writer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But but as the writer, you got to do that. You have to
Yep.
you have to get people interested in your characters and your story. And it amazes me how many times I'll start a book, and like I said, I get 30, 40 pages into it, and you go, what is this about? What is this guy trying to do? And if you don't know by that time
Right.
what the objective is and who the character is and what he's trying to do, then you've lost the reader.
Yeah, I probably finish one out of every three books I start
Yeah,
these days.
yeah,
I
exactly. Yeah,
I just have a loaded Kindle and I go through and I'm like, oh,
yeah,
start something. I'm like, yeah, this is good. I'll keep going. Or 20, 30 pages in, I'm like, yeah, I'm
yeah.
moving on.
Yeah, I told my wife that. She too was always one to finish it, and I said, "Nah, your time's too valuable.
Right.
If it hasn't hooked you by 50 pages, get rid of it."
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree
Yeah.
completely. What would you say is your most controversial book and why?
Well, probably the first Vietnam book that I wrote, because I tried to cover all the jobs, and I've had more feedback on that book from people picking at this or picking at that, only because like I've heard some vets say, "Oh, there's not enough action in that book." And in fact, in the second Vietnam book, the last time I looked, I had 54 star ratings. 53 of them were 5-star. One of them was a 3 or 4-star. A guy wrote, "There's not enough action in it." I'm thinking to myself, this is real life. This isn't, I'm
Right.
not writing adventure stories, but some people think that way, and some people, some of the Marines or whatnot who were in the first book thought, you got too many truck drivers and cooks. But I was trying intentionally to show all the jobs that people
Right.
did.
And they all have a story.
They all have a story, and most people get that. A few don't. But
One thing I think it's interesting, and I think most people that are civilians never been in the military, and the only reason I know this stuff is because I grew up in the
yeah,
military.
you said you were an Army
I was an
brat.
Army brat. Is that everybody, even in the infantry, everybody has a regular job. Like one of my buddies I played football with in college, he was in ROTC, and his job,
Hmm.
and we used to make fun of him. He was a printer repair guy. That was his. I mean, he was in the infantry, but he was a, he was a printer repair guy, and that was his job.
Your assigned duties. Yeah,
right.
Those were always the ones you hated.
So we talked earlier a little bit about some of the books that you like to read. You mentioned Thor, some Connolly. Is there one particular book or a couple books that you would recommend people should absolutely read?
The most recent Michael Connolly I read was Dark Sacred Night. I think that's one of his more recent. I like that. I also went back. A lot of times I'll go back with some of them and read, the book that kind of really made them. And like Daniel Silva, I recently went back and read his first book in the series, The Kill Artist. That it's interesting to go back and see how he started. How did he start the character? How did he establish this guy?
Do you think the writing gets better for these big, like if you start a Michael Connolly series, do you think he proves as an artist from the first book to the last?
I think his case, he's just consistently good.
Okay.
I don't think any better. But I find Silva a bit up and down. And I do find the early guy. Another guy that I find pretty consistent is Ken Follett. I recently reread Eye of the Needle. Mm-hmm. And I read something he talked about how he wrote that he wrote that book in about 3 weeks. And it was, it just kind of came to him, and how he was frustrated. He had been getting rejected on stuff, and he just finally sat down and wrote it, and it suddenly burst on the scene, as a big successful book, and it kind of surprised him. But he wrote it; it just came to him, and how he wrote it was interesting. I think it was in the preface to this was now the 40th anniversary or something of the. And this was an anniversary edition or something, but he went back and talked about how he wrote it. And I always, as long as I've been writing, I've always enjoyed reading stuff about how other writers write, both physically, what kind of space do they have? When do they write?
Yeah.
Where do they get their ideas? That's always kind of interesting, especially interesting perspective on looking at how other people write.
Did you read Stephen King's On Writing?
Yes.
That's one of my favorites as far as a writing craft type book.
Yeah. And there's a picture in there of him in this little, it doesn't look like his writing office when he started, wasn't much bigger than a closet. And he's got a space heater down along one wall that he's got paper stacked on top of.
Books all over the place.
Books all over the place. He's got this little dinky desk with an old-fashioned computer on it, and he's got his feet up, and it's just with books stacked to the ceiling.
Yeah.
That if they've tipped over and fell, they'd never dig them out of the thing. It's but looking at that kind of thing, and I forget who was Thomas Wolfe, the very famous writer from the 30s. He was a very big guy, and he would write standing, and he wrote on top of the refrigerator, which then were much smaller than the ones today. And he wrote out longhand. He'd write a page, and he had a cardboard box there, and he'd just drop the page in the cardboard box. When he was finished, he'd send the box off to his editor, I guess. Nice if you could do that. Or who was the Barbara Cartland, the English romance writer. She had a big one of these old leather and she was I think English nobility or something, but she had this chateau she lived in, but she had one of these old psychiatrist couches, these leather things you kind of laid on. And she would lay on this thing with one of her feather boas around her neck and dictate her books to her secretary. It just dictated the book. I thought,
so
wow,
much has changed.
I can't do that. To me, writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And if I haven't rewritten something 10 times,
although there's people dictating books now, they go for a walk in the woods and talk the book. And the great thing about your writing is that you're focused. You're very, very focused on craft and writing a good book. And I think that's been lost in this crazy race to put out 30 or 40 books or whatever it is and write as quickly as possible and do all this crazy marketing, where you're just like, well, I'm going to do the best I can to put out a good book. And if it takes me 6 months or it takes me a year, then, that's how long it takes.
Yeah. Sadly, you don't know how much, I mean, I know that my core readers like that, does which really pays off best, I don't know. I'm not going to terribly criticize people who do it a different way, because if it works for them and it works for their readers, that's fine.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of very well-known authors that are cranking out
Yep.
a few books a year, and they're writing quality books, and
Yeah.
that's a talent for sure.
Yep. Better than mine.
Yeah, right. I think that I get the sense that you've also got a lot of research that goes into your books too.
Yeah.
I've talked to authors here on the show that were like, "Hey, I don't really do much research because I write about stuff that I know for the most part," and I would imagine that goes a lot quicker.
Or if it's really a continuing thing,
Right.
you can get by with less.
Right.
And that's true.
Right. Well, Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate
pleasure.
it. Where can people find out about you and your books?
On Amazon, on Kindle. If they search William F. Brown, that should bring it up. Or the Vietnam books are called Our Vietnam Wars, plural, because it's, everybody has a different war, and or they could, and in there also is the Bob Burke series of or my others, which us writers, we equally love all of our children.
Of course. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Phil.
Great. Thank you for listening to another episode of Your Next Great Novel. Be sure to subscribe. You can find the podcast at philwbooks.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn.